The knock came just after midnight. 3 slow, uncertain taps that barely echoed through the weather-beaten wood of the front door. Ethan Hayes froze in the middle of his living room, clutching the frayed strap of his son's busted backpack. He'd been stitching it together again for the 3rd time that month, using an old shoelace as thread, trying to make it last just a bit longer. He didn't have the money for a new one. Heck, he barely had enough left for next week's groceries. Another knock, this time softer, hesitant. Ethan glanced at the couch where his 8-year-old son, Noah, lay curled up in a tangle of blankets, already deep in dreams. The boy's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that comforted him more than anything in the world. His heart pounded as he walked to the door. No one ever came here this late. Not in their quiet, beat-down corner of rural Kentucky where most people kept to themselves and trust was earned like war medals. He opened the door halfway, just enough to peek through, and there she stood, a woman, soaked from head to toe. Her long brown hair clung to her cheeks like wet ribbons, her coat torn and hanging open, revealing a bloodied elbow and trembling hands. Her lips quivered as she tried to speak, but only one word escaped, barely a whisper. Please. Ethan didn't move. Her eyes were pleading. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. Just raw. He knew that look. The kind of desperate you don't fake. I'm not dangerous, she said, her voice rasping as if she hadn't spoken in hours. I've been walking since sundown. My car broke down. No cell. No light. Please, just one night. Ethan opened the door wider, scanning the darkness behind her. No car. No headlights. Just the wet glint of the gravel road stretching out behind her like a forgotten path. He didn't have money. Didn't have spare food. Didn't have time for strangers. But he had been exactly where she was once. Worse, maybe. And Noah. What about Noah? Still, without thinking, Ethan stepped aside. One night, he said. That's it. She exhaled a breath that sounded like it had been caged for days and stumbled through the threshold. Ethan locked the door behind her. He gave her a towel, some of his ex-wife's old clothes he hadn't had the heart to donate, and a place to sleep on the couch. She didn't ask for more. Didn't say her name. Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after she'd curled up under a blanket, staring at the flickering light above the sink. Something about the way she walked, wincing, limping, almost afraid to let her feet touch the ground, rattled him. This wasn't just a broken-down car. There was something else she wasn't saying. The house was silent, but Ethan didn't sleep. He kept the hammer from the shed on his nightstand, just in case. But morning came quiet and uneventful. And when he went into the living room, the couch was empty. No woman, no blanket, no towel, nothing, except a small note, scribbled on the back of a receipt. Thank you. You saved me. I'll come back. Ethan stared at the note, heart thudding. He didn't know why, but the message left his hands trembling. A week passed. No sign of her. No call. No return. Just life as usual, working double shifts at the auto shop, scraping by, pretending everything was fine for Noah's sake. But then, strange things started happening. First, it was the envelope taped to his door. No name. No return address. Inside, a $100 bill. Then another, 2 days later. Then 2 more. Ethan tried to return it. Asked around. Called everyone he knew. Nothing. He was scared. Confused. And then, curious. Who was she? Why him? And what did she mean by, I'll come back? The question didn't haunt him until he came home one night and found Noah sitting on the porch steps with wide eyes. Daddy, the boy whispered. She came back. She was here. Ethan dropped his tools. What? When? Just now. She asked if I remembered her. I said yes. She smiled and gave me this. He held up a paper bag. Inside, a fresh pair of school shoes. Ethan dropped to his knees, staring at the shoes in disbelief. The exact size, the brand his son had wanted for months. How? She said you saved her life, Dad, Noah said quietly. She said she was coming back to return the favor. But this wasn't a thank you. This was something else. And when Ethan finally saw her again, standing under the street lamp across from his house, half hidden in the shadows, watching, he realized with a sick twist in his gut, she wasn't just someone he helped. She was someone running from something, and it had followed her here. She was standing perfectly still beneath the flickering street lamp, arms wrapped tightly around herself like the night might swallow her if she let go. Rain had started again, light but cold, spattering against the pavement like a ticking clock. Ethan's breath hitched as he stepped off the porch. He didn't shout, didn't call her name, because he still didn't know it. But she looked up anyway, eyes locking with his like she had felt him coming. She looked worse than before. Not physically. If anything, she looked cleaner, dressed in a worn hoodie and jeans that fit her. But it was her eyes. That haunted look. Like she'd seen something that could never be unseen. He crossed the street slowly. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. "Especially if someone's looking for you." She didn't respond immediately. Just swallowed hard, voice barely audible. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Ethan glanced behind her. No car. Again. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. She smiled faintly. A broken kind of smile. "I was. But it's not that simple anymore." "Try me." Her arms tightened around herself. "I don't want to bring anything dangerous near your son." "You already came back," he said. "That means something's already near." Silence hung between them, heavy, like a held breath. Then, without a word, she took a step forward, and something in her gave way. She stumbled. Ethan caught her just before she collapsed. Up close, he saw it. Her skin was clammy. Her shoulder was bleeding. Not fresh, but not clean either. He didn't hesitate. He brought her inside. She sat at the edge of the kitchen table while Ethan gently peeled back the sleeve of her hoodie. There was a long, deep gash along her upper arm, crusted with dried blood and dirt. He cleaned it carefully, silently, while she winced but never complained. "You need a hospital," he said. "I can't," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because they'll find me there." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Ooh." Her hand shook as she took a slow breath. "My name is Harper," she finally said, "and I used to belong to someone." The word belong made Ethan's blood run cold. "He's not my husband," she added quickly, like she could hear the assumption forming. "Not legally, but he kept me like one. For 3 years." She didn't cry, didn't tremble in some dramatic movie way. Her voice was flat, hollow, but her words cut like glass. "He owns people," Harper said. "Not with chains, not with contracts, but with fear, with secrets, with control so deep you forget who you were before you met him." Ethan sat down across from her, saying nothing. "I escaped 2 weeks ago. I've been running ever since." He doesn't forgive disobedience. He hunts it. A beat passed. "You think he followed you here?" Ethan asked. "I know he did." That night, Ethan barely slept again, and by morning, he realized he didn't want to send her away. He couldn't, not after seeing what she was running from. But kindness has a cost. Because that morning, Ethan went out to start his truck and found the windshield shattered, the hood scratched deep with a single word. "Thief." He stood frozen, the metal still glistening with fresh dew, knowing it hadn't been there the night before. Noah peeked out the window. "Daddy, who did that?" Ethan turned away before his son could see the fury, no, the fear, in his eyes. He didn't confront Harper until Noah was safely at school. "Did you tell anyone where you were going?" he asked, arms crossed, voice tighter than he intended. "No," she said, confused. "I haven't spoken to anyone." "Then how the hell did he find you?" Her face drained of color. "I don't know." He pointed to the truck. "He was here last night, Harper. Watching. Marking. That's my kid in this house." "I never meant to put him in danger," she said, voice shaking now. "I just needed one night. I didn't expect this." Ethan rubbed his hands down his face. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell her to leave, to go far away and never look back. But he didn't. Instead, he said, "You stay. Until we figure this out." "Why?" "Because someone gave me a chance once," he muttered. "Because you don't look like someone who's had many of those." She looked down, blinking fast. And for the first time since she showed up, she whispered, "Thank you." But Ethan didn't say you're welcome. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of it. This was the beginning. The next day, it escalated. First, someone broke into the shed out back. Nothing stolen, just wrecked. Tools tossed, drawers open, things smashed. Then, someone left a small package on the front porch. Inside, a phone, already turned on, already recording. A voice, smooth, confident, terrifyingly calm, echoed through the speaker. "Harper, you know what happens to things I lose. But don't worry, I never lose for long." The recording ended, but the message stayed, burned into their bones. Harper collapsed onto the floor, hands over her mouth. Ethan picked up the phone with shaking fingers and quietly smashed it into the wall. Whatever this man was, he had resources, eyes, access. But Ethan had something too. He had nothing left to lose. And men with nothing left to lose are the ones who fight hardest. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the shards of the phone he'd smashed against the wall. The screen was cracked into a spiderweb, the casing bent, but that voice, that cold, polished, serpentine voice, still rang in his head. I never lose for long. That wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Down the hall, Harper sat at the kitchen table, unmoving, her hands wrapped tight around a mug she hadn't taken a single sip from. Her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on nothing. Noah was at school. Thank God. Ethan walked in slowly. Start talking, he said, calm but deadly serious. Everything. No skipping. No softening. Harper didn't look up. You don't want to know. Yes, I do. Because now my kid's in this. My house is in this. So you talk. She sat there in silence for a moment. Then she breathed in, deeply, like surfacing from water, and began. His name is Callum Bray, she said. But that's not the name you'll find in public records. On paper, he's clean, legitimate, investor, philanthropist, even sits on a few boards. He makes his money by buying distressed companies, flipping them, selling them. But that's not what he really does. She finally looked up, her voice hoarse. He owns people, Ethan. He finds the desperate ones. Single moms, runaways, people who've hit bottom. Then he offers them help, jobs, homes, security. For free. No contracts. Just trust. And by the time you realize what he really wants, it's too late. Ethan felt something burning in his stomach. What did he want from you? Everything, she said quietly. My voice. My time. My body. My silence. She stood up, suddenly pacing. At first, it was just running errands. Admin work. Then I started noticing things. How people around him disappeared. How women came to work once and were never seen again. How some men owed him favors and ended up in prison or in accidents that made no sense. I wanted to leave, and he smiled when I told him. Smiled. Then he locked the doors. Her hand trembled against the edge of the counter. He kept me there for 3 years. Every time I tried to run, he made someone close to me suffer. My sister, she lost custody of her kids after a CPS tip. My landlord got audited. My best friend got in a random car wreck. I don't know how, but he did it. Ethan's chest felt like stone. How did you finally get out? I stopped caring if I lived, she said simply. I climbed out a bathroom window one night and ran through the woods. No plan, no car, just one bag in my legs. And he's been hunting you ever since. She nodded. Then we have to call the cops. She gave him a look so sharp it cut air. Callum owns half the cops in the Tri-County area. And the ones he doesn't own? He scares. Ethan's jaw locked. Then we'll go to the media. Blow it up. He also funds 3 local news stations. Feds. He's too smart. Everything illegal is under shell companies and layers. There's no proof unless you lived it. And most of those people are too broken to talk. Ethan rubbed his face. Jesus. I didn't come to you for help, Ethan, she said. I came here because I needed one quiet night before I kept running. He looked her dead in the eyes. You're not running anymore. That night, Ethan bolted the doors, sealed the windows, and pulled out his old hunting rifle, the one he'd stored away after Noah was born. The next morning, he didn't go to work. Instead, he started calling favors. He had one friend he trusted, Cal Morris, a combat veteran turned junkyard operator, a man who owed Ethan for saving his life in a factory fire years ago. If anyone knew how to go dark, it was Cal. They met in a mechanic's garage on the edge of town, behind locked gates and 3 broken-down sedans. Cal took one look at Harper's pale face and Ethan's bloodshot eyes and nodded. All right, he said. Let's cause some problems. By nightfall, Cal had gotten Harper a burner phone, a second identity, and a safe house address 4 counties over. I can get you out tonight, he told her. But once you leave, don't contact Ethan again. Don't come back. You get one shot. She turned to Ethan. He waited. No, she said suddenly. I'm not running. Ethan's eyes widened. What? I've been running for years. I'm done. If I disappear, he wins. He gets to keep doing it. To other women. To kids, probably. I'd rather die fighting. Ethan stared at her, stunned. Then, slowly, he nodded. Then we fight. 3 days later, Ethan's house was firebombed while Noah was at school. They got out alive. Barely. Everything was gone. The living room, the couch, the walls, all ashes. All except a burned scrap of paper found in the mailbox. You should have stayed out of it. Ethan held the note in shaking hands, smoke still curling in the air behind him. And for the first time in years, something inside him snapped. He wasn't a victim. Not anymore. Now, he was a father with nothing to lose. And that made him the most dangerous man alive. The fire left nothing. No home. No keepsakes. No family photos. Not even the backpack Ethan had stitched up for Noah again and again. Gone. They stood across the street, wrapped in donated blankets, watching the fire department hose down the remains of their life. Neighbors gathered silently. No one said a word. Ethan's fists were clenched at his sides. Noah stood beside him, too shocked to cry, too young to understand that this burning was not some accident. It was a warning. Harper stood behind them, eyes red, jaw locked. Ethan finally turned to her, voice gravelly and low. I'm going to end this. Harper looked like she was about to argue, but then she saw the look in his eyes, the raw, shattered fury, and just nodded. What do you need? She asked. Ethan didn't answer with words. He pulled out his old flip phone and dialed a number he hadn't touched in over a decade. Cal, he said when the voice answered. We're going hunting. Callum Bray's world operated in the shadows, but his wealth paraded in daylight. His name was attached to 2 hotels, a logistics company, a media firm, and 5 nonprofits that conveniently funneled tax-deductible funds into phantom projects. But Cal had friends, ex-intelligence friends, the kind who could find holes in a ghost record. By midnight, they had a location. Callum's weekend home, an off-grid estate deep in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Security tight, private guards, cameras, no police patrols for miles. Exactly the kind of place a man like him would feel safe. Ethan didn't care about odds. He only cared about Noah, and the fact that the man who firebombed their home had sent a message loud and clear. So Ethan was going to return one. They didn't go in guns blazing. That would be suicide. Instead, they studied, surveilled, waited. For 3 nights, Ethan and Cal watched from the ridge, mapping routines, noting weaknesses. Harper stayed at a secure cabin with Noah, far from the fire's reach. Ethan had insisted. He needed them safe. On the 4th night, they moved. Ethan and Cal approached the rear fence under the cover of darkness. The guards rotated every 6 minutes. 1 minute of overlap. Just enough for Ethan to slip in, silent, deliberate. He'd worked construction jobs for years. He knew how to move without a sound. The mansion loomed above like a sleeping beast. Inside, Callum Bray lounged in a study, sipping brandy, reading a book bound in black leather. He had no idea that the man whose life he tried to erase was already inside. Ethan didn't go for violence first. He went for proof. He found it in the basement. Files, photos, video, drives labeled with names and dates. A girl no older than 15. A man handcuffed to a chair. Contracts forged and coerced. Every terrible suspicion Harper had spoken of, confirmed in pixels and paper. It was worse than he imagined. And in that moment, Ethan knew killing Callum would be too easy. He needed to destroy him. Publicly. So he took the drives. Every one of them. And he walked back out. Until the alarm tripped. Then all hell broke loose. Ethan ran through the woods, bullets snapping past like mosquitoes. Cal laid down cover fire, shouting into the walkie-talkie as they ducked behind rocks under trees. But they made it out. Barely. Back to the truck. Back to Harper. Back to Noah. And with them, the key to ending it all. The files were passed through encrypted channels to Cal's hacker friend in D.C., a former federal agent turned ghost. She reviewed the footage, verified it, cross-referenced victims, names, disappearances. Then, she reached out to the only journalist brave and angry enough to blow it wide open. Her name was Amelia Gray, a war reporter turned domestic investigator. She'd lost her niece to trafficking, never found her, until she opened the first file from Ethan. Her hands trembled. There was her niece, in Callum's basement, in the background. It was all the motivation she needed. The next morning, Amelia aired the first segment live on national television. She didn't blur names, didn't hide faces, didn't care about threats. Callum Bray's name was the headline. The video ran for 8 minutes straight. Disturbing, undeniable, brutal. Within hours, it was viral. By evening, the FBI raided all 5 of his properties. By nightfall, he was gone. Vanished. Ethan stared at the TV in silence. Harper beside him, clutching Noah's hand. "Do you think he'll run forever?" she whispered. "No," Ethan said. "People like him don't run. They plan." And he was right, because at 3:24 a.m., the front door of the cabin creaked open, and Callum Bray walked in, bloodied, calm, smiling. "You made me famous," he said. Then he raised the pistol. What happened next was pure instinct. Ethan lunged. They crashed through furniture, through walls, fighting like animals. Ethan took a punch to the ribs. Callum took a knife to the shoulder. Blood sprayed. Harper screamed. Noah hid behind the couch. And then, bang. The sound echoed. Then silence. Callum staggered back. Ethan held the gun now. Callum looked down at the bullet wound in his stomach. "Should have stayed poor," he muttered, collapsing. And with that, it was over. The authorities came hours later. There were questions, statements, and then quiet. A calm Ethan hadn't felt in years. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood on the porch of a new home, small, modest, but theirs, donated anonymously. Harper walked out holding 2 mugs of coffee, Noah trailing behind with a baseball glove. They sat, watched the sunrise. Harper leaned into Ethan's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "You stayed. That's what changed everything." And as the morning light broke over the hills for the first time in a long, long time, they all breathed, freely, together. The days that followed Callum Bray's death were a blur of questions, investigations, and quiet victories. The world had seen the truth. News outlets across the country called it one of the largest criminal unmaskings of the decade. Victims came forward by the dozens. Survivors. Families of the missing. The country was watching, and for once, justice wasn't delayed. It was delivered. But for Ethan, Harper, and Noah, the real story wasn't on the screens. It was in the quiet moments. The healing ones. They didn't talk much about that night. Not because they were avoiding it, but because they didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer full of fear. It was full of understanding. Ethan rebuilt what little he could. He used the money from a quiet settlement the FBI had arranged for victims' assistance, though he never asked for it, never wanted it. He just wanted his life back. But something unexpected happened. People started showing up. A woman from across the state brought Harper flowers, said her daughter had been missing for 6 years, until she saw her in one of the files. Harper's escape had blown open the truth. A young man came to Ethan's shop, silent, broken, with a scar across his temple. He said nothing, just hugged Ethan and whispered, "He had me too." And every time, Ethan would just nod, grip their shoulder, and say, "You're free now." Because that was the real victory. Not just surviving, but giving others the chance to survive too. Harper started volunteering at a women's shelter. Quiet first, mostly behind the scenes. But one day, she told her story to a room full of women who were exactly where she had once been. And something shifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was leading. And they listened, because when Harper spoke, it wasn't with pity or performance. It was with truth. Her pain became a lantern, and the darkness started to shrink. As for Noah, he asked fewer questions as time went on. He started sleeping through the night again, smiling more, laughing at the stupid cartoons Ethan used to watch with him when things were better. He told his teacher that his dad was a superhero. Ethan cried when he heard that. Not in front of Noah, but later, quietly, alone, because he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had made one terrifying, risky decision, and somehow, it had saved not just one life, but many. One afternoon, months later, Ethan and Harper sat on the porch. The sky was that perfect orange blue you only get just before sunset. She looked over and asked, "Do you ever regret letting me in that night?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out at the driveway, where Noah was drawing with sidewalk chalk, at the new house, the fresh start. And then he said, "You know what I regret?" She raised an eyebrow. "Not asking your name the moment you walked through my door." Harper smiled, tears threatening to rise. You were scared, she said gently. No, he replied. I was numb. Life had beaten everything out of me. And then you showed up. Hurt, afraid, barely breathing. And somehow, saving you brought me back to life. She blinked fast, brushing away a tear. Ethan looked at her then, not as a stranger, not even as a friend, but as the person who had changed everything. You didn't just survive, Harper, he said quietly. You won. She reached over and took his hand. We both did. And as the sun dipped below the hills, casting golden light over their quiet street, Ethan leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt peace. No revenge, no rage, just peace. Because he'd saved a stranger, and she'd save him right back.